All right, so not a whole lot to dive into before we start here, but a couple things I wanted to mention. So we'll pick up where we left off in terms of the material. I did move your original exam score into this ungraded category so you can kind of still see what your raw score was. But I then uploaded kind of those curved midterm exam scores, and that is now what is currently counting towards your grade. Okay, so you should be able to see those show up on Canvas. Now, the grade you see on Canvas is a little bit, I don't want to say like a misleading, but a little bit of a rosy kind of picture in that we have one exam, which is 20%, but we're ultimately going to have 3 exams. So at the end of the semester, your exams are going to be a larger percent of your overall grade. So if you want to give yourself a worst case scenario, I kind of have this hypothetical grade tool that I showed you last class, but there's a way to use it to kind of give yourself worst case scenario. So you put in what your current grades are in every category. You've got your midterm exam grade. If you make your midterm and final exam that exact same, so you assume I keep getting the same scores on my exam, the hypothetical grade would kind of tell you this is like worst case scenario. I keep doing as well as I did in the first exam. Now, obviously, if I do a little bit better, my hypothetical score at the end of the semester will be higher, right? But kind of putting in whatever value you got on the first exam for all 3 of the exams, that kind of gives you like worst case scenario where you're at right now. Okay. Now, what will also happen, right? You can get more CL points by the end of the semester. If your quiz, you drop your 2 lowest quizzes. So like some of these scores can change and go up as well. It's just kind of hard to know exactly how much until we get towards the end of the semester and we have your all your quiz scores, all of your in-class quizzes in. Okay. But kind of playing around with that midterm 2 and final can kind of give you a worst case scenario example or idea. Okay. All right. Any questions for me before we, I'll post an announcement with this. I'm going to try to do it from memory. I believe it's the room in Ballantine Hall 203, or it's 213. I looked it up before class, and from my last section, I forgot exactly. But I'll post an announcement. The CL leader won't be there tonight. So 2 of the time blocks, there will only be 2 available CL session locations as opposed to 3. But there's still going to be CL locations, multiple locations at every single time. I'll post up kind of what location that is on Canvas once I get back to my office after class. Okay. I just wanted to mention that so you're aware of that and can look for exactly what room that is. And I think there's multiple rooms in Ballantine. So even if you went there, no one's there. There should be one right down the hall. But I did have them reach out to me late last night that they are not going to be able to make it. Okay. Other than that, any questions for me before we kind of dive into material? Try to give you guys as much time because I know we had a lot of stuff to kind of cover today. No other questions? Okay. So we left off last class talking about price floors. Now we did it in the context of a labor market. So I'll probably try to go kind of quickly through some of the slides because I did most of the work on the dot cam on Tuesday. So this should look like somewhat review. But we said if I had a binding price floor, it needed to be set above or below the equilibrium price. So remember, a price floor doesn't let the market go to any lower of a price. So an effective price floor needs to be set above. We were using the labor market as a specific example of this. And so we said anytime we have a price floor, what's going to happen? So if we start out in equilibrium, and we'll be using this a lot today, the same graph and model. What is consumer surplus before we have any changes? It's the area below demand. We're looking at consumers, but above our price, equilibrium price. So A, B, and E here. What's producer surplus? The area below price, but above producers, so above the supply curve. I said a less technical way, consumer surplus is on top, producer surplus is on the bottom. So C, D, and F would be producer surplus. If I had a price floor that raised the price, it was an effective price floor, what is it going to do to quantity? We said it had the same impact as a price ceiling, and it does what in the market? Increases or decreases quantity. So it's going to create something, but if we think about what is the new quantity of units sold and produced and consumed in the market, it's going to be where that price ceiling hits our demand curve. because past that point, no consumer is going to be willing to buy this good. So our quantity demanded will be what dictates the new quantity in the market. So with a price ceiling and a price floor, what happened to quantity? It went down. Now the quantity demanded at this higher price is below the quantity supplied, so we have more people are producing it than want to buy it, so we've got a surplus in the number of units. With price ceilings, we ended up with shortages. Okay. Now, we know this new quantity in the market now is lower, so price ceilings and floors had the same impact and they reduced quantity. What is our consumer surplus now? Still, it's going to be the area below our demand curve, but now instead of above the old equilibrium price, it's the area above the price ceiling price. So our consumer surplus is going to be this much smaller area of A. What is producer surplus? Still going to be the area above our supply curve, but instead of being below the equilibrium price, it's now going to be below the new price of the price ceiling, right? So area kind of B, C, and D would represent our producer surplus here, okay? Now, because we saw this reduction in quantity, right? What does this area E and F represent? Deadweight loss, or the loss of total surplus. So total surplus, if we're looking at both producers and consumers, we're not going to look at price. It's just going to be the difference between our demand and our supply curve. Because we're just concerned with, they don't care if it comes from producers or consumers, it's just a loss of surplus from somewhere. So that area in between our supply and demand curve, for every unit that we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market, that area represented our deadweight loss, okay? So we said E and F is deadweight loss. E comes from who? So before the price ceiling, E used to be consumer surplus and F used to be, so part of that deadweight loss comes from both groups. What did area B represent? So it is now producer surplus. What did it used to be? So B is going to represent that transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus. So with a price floor, the transfer goes from consumers to producers. That's a higher price, good thing for people selling it. With a price ceiling, we said that kind of shift in surplus, it went from producers to consumers. Lower price benefited the consumers, okay? So that was kind of our changes in these producer surplus, consumer surplus, deadweight loss. We'll go through this quickly because hopefully this is like starting to, you're just finding the area of like very basic geometric shapes. So if I looked at before and after consumer surplus, I want the area below demand but above the price, and the area below the equilibrium price but above my supply. So this entire triangle would be what? Looks like the height is 40, base is 40, 40 times a half is 800. Producer surplus, area below the equilibrium price, above our supply curve. 40 is the height, 40 is the base, 40 times 40 is times a half is 800. We started out in the example here where producer and consumer surplus are the same, okay? Now, after this price ceiling, how do I find my new consumer surplus? It would be what color? Consumer surplus is the blue area, right? The area or shape on top, right? Or the area below the demand curve, consumers of the demand curve, but above the new price that they're paying. So here I'd have what? 30 is the height, 30 is the base, 30 times a half gives me that 450. Okay. Now, what's producer surplus? Color-wise, it is the green area, the shape on bottom, or the area above its producers, above our supply curve, but below that new price. So I now have the area of a rectangle and the area of a triangle. So 30 times a half plus 20 times 30. So I'd have what? 1,050 if I'm doing the math here, correct? Okay. So what happened with a higher price? Who should benefit? Is a higher price good for consumers? Who is it good for? So what happened in producer surplus? Went up. What happened to consumer surplus? Went down, right? So this is a fairly intuitive result. We like those. We don't like the counterintuitive results. And then what was deadweight loss? So the area-wise, it's the red triangle. But instead of calculating the area of that triangle, from these numbers, how could I determine deadweight loss? It would be the difference between total surplus before the price ceiling and total surplus after. What was total surplus before? 1,600. What is it after? 1,500. So hopefully dead weight loss, if I calculate the area of that red triangle, sure enough, gives me that same value of 100. So right, we can visually calculate it, but if we also have the numbers for producer and consumer surplus, it's that loss of total surplus in the market because of this price ceiling. Okay. So kind of a quick review. Like I said, this puts some actual numbers to it, similar to what we did with price floors. We had drawn out that model at the end of last class for price floors already. So kind of remembering these price controls. Here's the counterintuitive part. A floor is on the bottom, but for it to be effective, it actually has to be set above the equilibrium price, and the ceiling actually has to be set below. So kind of a counterintuitive result. You have to stop and think about that a little bit harder. Now, if I have ineffective price floors or ineffective price ceilings, read quiz questions, exam questions carefully. If it's ineffective, what is the dead weight loss? 0. Nothing changes in the market. Okay? So make sure you check to see if it's, first thing you should always check, if I tell you just a value, is it an effective price floor or ceiling? Okay? Now, we talked about this last class. The example I used for a price floor was the minimum wage. I'll mention at the end of the class, the next Canvas discussion is kind of related to this idea. If we have time, I don't think we probably will. I hope we do. I'm going to go through an example where I remind us that minimum wages, well, if a price floor reduces quantity, we said a minimum wage is a price floor, so reduction in quantity of labor is just unemployment, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of a class. If we have time, we'll take a look at what we call efficiency wages, and we'll start to think about how this kind of labor market, how using of that price floor, how it connects to that next Canvas discussion. So I'll save that till the end of class, so we'll kind of revisit this. I want to make sure we have some time for that, so I might go through this. I went through this a little bit quicker because we'll revisit it. Okay. All right. So another thing that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, because I know taxes are harder, is a control that the government has, which is quotas. So I've got a graph on the slides, but I think I'm going to I can do a better job of kind of telling you exactly what that means by drawing it out for us. Okay. So quotas are kind of tricky, because usually when you hear the word quota, it's like in the context of a production facility, and a quota means they have to produce, we've got to produce 1,000 units today. Like we're trying to get quantity to be higher. A government quota is essentially like it limits the number of units we can see in this market. Quite often, we don't put quotas on our domestic firms. We do it to who? We say we can only import a certain amount. So usually quotas are put on like non-domestic, or we think about kind of foreign markets. So we're only allowing a certain number of that good to come into the country. So here's what a quota would look like. So if I've got my quota, if it's effective, well, before, the quantity that would be coming in from this international market is a much higher quantity. We want to, politically they sell it as like, oh, we want to help our homegrown businesses. So they reduce that quantity, right? You can tell I'm a bit skeptical. So the reason why is because if I limit the quantity, well, what am I going to do, right? At that quantity, how much would the last consumer be willing to pay? Wherever we're at on the demand curve. So what I know, I'll try to keep consumers blue here today. I know that if producers had a lot of power, well, hold on. So I'll hold off on this. This is the price that the consumer, the highest price they'd be willing to pay. What is the lowest price the producer would be willing, or the suppliers would be willing to receive? Well, whatever their marginal cost is. So we know for sure at this lower quantity, what would producer surplus be? Well, if this was the price, the area below that and above the supply curve, here would be kind of our producer surplus. The area below the demand curve, but above that highest price consumers would be willing to pay, would be consumer surplus. Now, these units are being sold, so what's happening with the surplus in the middle here? Before we talk about that, what do we know for sure has been created because of this reduction in quantity? If I see fewer units being purchased and sold, What was lost? Surplus from each one of those units. So I know with a quota, I'm going to have deadweight loss. So what's going on with this surplus in the middle here? Well, if producers have a lot of power in the market, so this is like, companies will put out like limited releases of things where they reduce quantity, where like everybody wants to buy it, right? So the producers know that they have a lot of power in that market. What can they probably do? Increase price, right? They can get the price of this good to be a lot closer to what that consumer is willing to pay, right? So if producers have a lot of power in the market, what would producer surplus be now? Well, if they can get the price to be all the way up here, all of this would become producer surplus. Now, that's often what we see. Producers in most markets have more power than us, because there's more of us as consumers. There's going to be more competition to get this good that I've limited, right? That I put a restriction on the quantity of. Now, if the consumers had more power in the market, I would argue sometimes at this university, you guys have a lot of power over price. You might not feel that way, and it might be like weird kind of prices, but you have a lot of sway over what the university does because they don't exist without you, right? And so if there's a market where the consumers have more power, they can get the price to be closer to the price the seller is willing to accept. So it could be that this area would then become consumer surplus. So this area in the middle, it's really hard to say. I won't ask you questions about consumer producer surplus with quotas because we would need more information about who has more market power. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing game, right? It could be that the price still ends up anywhere in that range. So what could the price still end up being? The old equilibrium price. We just don't know without more information. So we won't dive into those issues. The only thing I would ask you about a quota is, what's happened to the quantity in the market? It went down. And what did we create? For sure, deadweight loss. In terms of like, were consumers or producers bet? We just don't know. It's hard. It's a harder question, or a question outside the scope of what we're going to cover. Okay. But the reason why it's harder, we can understand based off of like knowing what that supply and demand represent to us, which is the highest price that consumers would be willing to pay and the lowest price sellers are willing to accept. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So I drew it in the slides as if the producers had all of the power, because often that's what it is. But I wanted to show you that isn't necessarily the case. Okay. So we're going to switch gears, right? And we're going to talk about taxes for the rest of the class, with the exception of maybe the last 5-10 minutes. We'll talk about minimum wages again. Okay. So why do we pay taxes, right? Hopefully the government uses that money to do what? Create things for us, right? Or like make our lives better. Ultimately, do they do that? That's a longer discussion than we have time for, right? But we'll talk somewhat about that next week when we talk about positive externalities, okay? So we'll hold off a little bit on the question of why we pay taxes, but what types of taxes do we see out there? Well, if you've ever worked a job, you've paid income taxes, right? We have to pay them unless you're paid under the table, right? But if you're legally paid, you're on the books, you have to pay income taxes, right? Now, what's the most common tax we see? You pay it every day. Sales tax, right? Now, there are also specific what we call excise taxes. And we're going to the examples we'll use, we'll primarily use these. And I'm not going to like quiz you on the definition. I think it probably popped up on Top Hat. But it's the idea of an ad valorem tax, right? So a sales tax is what? Percentage based. We're just going to think about it to make it a little bit easier with the math. We're just going to use like a per unit tax. So instead of like a 10% tax, it's on every unit, there's a $1 tax. Just to make it a little bit easier with our models. It would be the same kind of results with a percentage tax. The math is just more complicated, okay? So we're going to look at these excise taxes often, and what we call an ad valorem tax is on every unit. Now, we see like things like alcohol, tobacco have specific taxes. And once we kind of work through our models, I'll try to kind of refer back to these and show why we might want to tax these goods. But here we're just listing the kind of taxes we see in the real world. And then we'll eventually talk about tax incidence, which is if the government ever gets involved in a market, price ceilings, price floors, quotas, what did we have created? Dead weight loss. If they get involved with taxes, what do you think is going to be created? Dead weight loss, right? So anytime the government gets involved, as long as they're using a tool effectively, it's going to create some dead weight loss in our market, with one caveat or exception, which we'll look at later on today. Okay? So here's just a basic example. I won't waste too much time on it. But let's say I have two individuals. They're trying to come together, and Matt's trying to sell his used car. David's trying to buy one. David would be willing to pay $11,000. Matt would be willing to sell his car for $10,000. Will that car get sold? There's a range of values in the middle between 10 and 11 where we'd both be okay with. Let's say Matt is feeling kind, right? And he agrees to sell his car to David for $10,000, his lowest amount he was willing to accept. David is like, great. The only problem is the government has decided to tax used cars by 15%. Well, what is the actual total cost? So here I've got a typo in my slides. I'm going to change it before I re-upload the slides for you guys on Canvas, but I wanted to make sure I did it in class so you're aware if you're looking at it. I forgot a 1 here. 10,000 times 0.15 should be 1,500, right? So now our example, the math lines up. I just want to mention that if you have the old slides, I'll get them updated after class today. I didn't pick up on that typo until a little bit later, but I wanted to make the change so that some people didn't have the old versions or the new versions. And so we've got, now the new price would be the $10,000 he has to pay Matt, but he also has to pay $1,500 to the government. Is he willing to pay $11,500? So does this transaction occur? This is just the most basic example. Taxes are going to do what in the market? If before this would have occurred, now this transaction doesn't, the quantity in the market is going to go down, right? So we hopefully know already when we start to build this model, taxes should always decrease the quantity we see in the market, okay? So taxes will stop transactions. So let's think about taxes on suppliers. So I've got this in the slides, but I'm going to build this model out for us. And we'll think about how taxes make our lives kind of complicated when we're analyzing these markets because it creates a difference in prices that we didn't have before. Okay, so if I have a market, right? Starting to sound like my son talking, right? So we've got marginal cost, marginal benefits. We start out, here was kind of our equilibrium price and quantity. If I tax producers, I think this is the easier tax to initially think about. What have I done to them? I've increased their what? So if I'm producing something and it cost me $1,000 to produce it, but now the government imposes a $100 tax, what's happened to my cost to produce it? It went up. It takes the same amount of material as was before. I got to pay that amount. I got to pay my workers. And now I have to pay an additional amount to the government. We actually use this in our supply and demand shifts that if I tax producers, supply is going to do what? Decrease or shift to the left. Decreases our movements towards that 0 point, right? Or another way of thinking about it is my costs are whatever they were before plus what? The value of that tax. At every quantity, and this is why we're using those ad valorem or per unit taxes, my cost of every single unit is whatever it was before, but now plus the tax I have to pay to the government from producing this, right? So I get this kind of decrease in supply, but it's because I've increased the cost of these producers, okay? So what would be the new equilibrium price in this market? Where would this supply curve with the tax equal my demand curve? Looks like it's going to be right here, right? Now, this is where we get something that looks a little different than the other models we've looked at. This is my new price in the market. It's going to be the price that consumers pay, okay? So I'm going to kind of write down here, here's our price that the consumer is going to pay. But if you go to a store, you hand them $100, and they had to pay a $10 tax on that, how much do they actually get to keep? 90. So whatever you pay as a consumer, how much do they get to keep? That. So the seller will get to keep the amount you paid minus the tax, right? Whatever money you give them, they have to take a portion of it, give it to the government, So they keep whatever you paid minus the tax. Okay. Or sorry, I'm writing this in the reverse way of what I'm saying it. So maybe to make this make a little more sense. Sorry. The price the consumer pays, what will be the price the seller keeps? Whatever the consumer pays minus the tax. Another way that we could write this is what's the price the consumer is going to actually pay, whatever the seller keeps plus the tax, right? Just different ways of kind of writing the same thing. Okay. So if the consumer pays this amount and the seller only gets to keep that amount minus the tax, where would I be at? Well, what's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve plus the tax? Just the value of the tax. So the price the consumer pays minus the value of that tax, this will be the price that the seller gets to keep. So what do we notice? The price the consumer pays will always be greater than the price that the seller gets to keep. In fact, what is that difference? If I just rearrange this equation a little bit, the value of that tax will always be the difference between the price the consumer pays and the price that the seller gets to keep. Okay? It'll always be that kind of vertical difference between our supply curve and our supply curve plus the tax, which is that difference is always just going to be the value of the tax. Okay. Any questions on anything here? We're okay with this? I'm just going to keep throwing more things at it. All right. Yeah. Why wouldn't it be the equilibrium? Because, I mean, if I hand over $100 as the consumer, that difference between here and here will not be the value of the tax. I mean, you can use intuition. If I pay $100 for something and the producer has to give $10 to the government, how much do they keep? 90, right? So whatever point you're at, you're always going to just, that's the price the consumer pays minus the value of the tax. You have to go down vertically, right? If we're thinking about visually on a graph. This difference could be, in fact, here, the way I've drawn it, it looks like it would only be about half the value of the tax, right? So that difference needs to be the complete value of the tax because that's how much money they have to give to the government. Yep. Yeah. Any other questions? So what is consumer and producer surplus now? So consumer surplus will be the area on top, bottom, top, right? Why? Because the consumer surplus is the difference between what is the consumer's marginal benefit, represents by the demand curve. What is the marginal cost? The new higher price they have to pay. So that difference between the price the consumer is paying and their demand curve, this now becomes consumer surplus. To not complicate the graph too much, right? What was it before? It was this entire triangle, right? When we were in equilibrium. Now, what is producer surplus? Producers, it's going to be the area above their supply curve, but below this new price that they get to keep. So before, it would have been this entire triangle. So what's happened to producer surplus? It has went down. What's happened to consumer surplus? It's went down, right? Now, we can intuitively think about why. Relative to the old equilibrium price, are consumers paying more or less than before? More. So are they going to be better or worse off? Worse off. Are suppliers or producers keeping more or less than before? So they're going to be worse off. Or we see producer and consumer surplus both decrease. Okay. So where is deadweight loss? Usually the way we define this was, after this tax, what is the quantity we see sold in this market? Oh, it's actually going to be a little bit lower, right? So typically we thought of deadweight loss as the loss of total surplus from all those units we're no longer seeing produced and consumed in the market. So that would still look the same as what we were doing with those price controls, okay? So it's just going to be the difference between our supply and demand curve, which represents total surplus. And that used to be surplus when we were in equilibrium. It no longer is. We're no longer seeing any quantity past that quantity after the tax, right? So we're losing all that surplus. What about this area in the middle? So if we think about what this represents, what is the height of that triangle? Or triangle. What is the height of that rectangle? What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps? Yeah, that difference, notice, will always be the value of the tax. What's the kind of base of that rectangle? It's always going to be the quantity that's produced and consumed after the tax. If I take how many units are out there on the market times the value of the tax on each unit, that would represent to me tax revenue, right? That's how much money is going to the government. If there's a $10 tax on every unit, 100 units is the quantity we see after the tax. How much money is going to the government? 100 times 10 or $1,000. So this area in the middle here represents our tax revenue, or sometimes maybe just call it government revenue, right? So we now have a third party involved. We've got consumers, producers, but we also have tax revenue, or what's another, I would call this like government surplus, right? So it's still going to be part of my total surplus. It's just that I've now introduced a third party, producers, consumers, and the government, right? The government benefits from these taxes, okay? Whereas before, they weren't involved in the market at all. I didn't have to worry about them. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. Yeah. So anytime we have any surplus, we're thinking about it's the difference between marginal costs and marginal benefits. Okay. What is the marginal benefit to producers? When they sell something, it would be the, when you sell something, if I had a store and I'm selling something, what is the benefit to me selling that? I receive the, but that money is what the price of that good is. So price is going to be our marginal benefit to our producers. What represents our producers' marginal costs? I always write it next to it. What represents marginal costs? Supply, right? We go quicker through this, you're going to have more time for the hard stuff, right? So it's always going to be the difference between the price. Now we have a differentiation now between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps. So now we're concerned with producer surplus. We want to use the price that the sellers keep. So that's why this area represented producer surplus. It's the area below the price that they're receiving for selling their good now, minus that supply curve or minus their marginal costs. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Total government revenue. Okay. Any other questions on this? Or keep moving. Okay. So we think about just another visualization of this. This was my producer and consumer surplus before. I said I'll be showing you this graph a lot, right? Just the area above price, below demand, that's consumer surplus. Area below that price and above the supply curve is producer surplus. We said kind of after this tax, right? The new price that the buyer or consumer pays will be higher. I'm just putting some numbers to it here. The new price that the seller gets to keep will be lower. What should the difference of that always be? The value of the tax. Whatever money the consumer hands over, the seller keeps that amount minus the tax, right? So here I had a $1 tax. That difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps is $1. So I then could think about my new consumer surplus, the area below demand, but above this new price that consumers pay. It's no longer, I'm not at that equilibrium price anymore, so I'm not using that. Producer surplus, no longer at the equilibrium, so the new price they keep will be this new price that they're getting to keep after the tax, but above their supply curve. We then said the area in the middle here represented tax revenue. And that's because what will the height of that rectangle always be? Well, what's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax? The value of the tax. What's the base of that rectangle always going to be? The quantity that's sold after the tax. Quantity sold times the value of the tax is just going to be the total tax revenue. And then deadweight loss will always be kind of that loss of surplus from those units we no longer see produced and consumed in the market. Now, it doesn't really have like a lot of intuitive relevance to us, but it is interesting to point out, what's the height of that deadweight loss triangle always going to be equal to? The value of the tax. What's the base of that triangle always going to be? The reduction in quantity after the tax. And then we have linear supply and demand curves, so we have to then multiply that by a half, right? That's the part that's not quite like interpretable, the times a half part. No, so it's how much they're getting to keep, right? So if the consumer hands over $100, but you have to pay a $10 tax, how much do you get to keep? So if they pay you 100, you have to pay 10 to the government, you only get to keep 90. So that price that they get to keep will always be below. Are you asking why it's below the old equilibrium? I mean, you could go through a mathematical proof, but if you have linear supply and demand curves, anytime you move up that curve a little bit, that difference between those two, it would always put you at a price that's below that old equal. It's just, like I said, there's a there's a geometrical proof to why that is, but that's just the way that linear equations would work. Yep. Yeah. Yep. So you're ahead of me. Hold on to your question, right? Okay. All right. So what about taxes on buyers, right? This is the one that I think is a little bit harder to think about. I often will give you depictions of taxes on producers, but we'll see that it doesn't matter, okay? So when I'm thinking about if I tax consumers, what have I done? If my marginal benefit to buying something before was $100, now when I buy it, I still get that marginal benefit, but if I have to pay a tax to the government, what's my kind of total benefit? Whatever my marginal benefit was before, minus the tax. So the demand curve at every point is going to be lower. My marginal benefit is going to be whatever it was before minus the tax. If I tax consumers, is that going to make them more or less likely to want to buy it? Less likely. So my demand is going to shift to the left or decrease, right? So a tax on consumers, right? We start out in equilibrium. It's going to look like a decrease in demand. Now, with this decrease in demand, where would be kind of my new equilibrium price after the tax? Where my supply is equal to my demand curve, okay? So this is going to be the new price that I see on this product. But now, producers aren't handing over money to the government. Who's handing money to the government now? Consumers. So when I go to the store, I know it shows up on your receipt, but let's say you go to the store and something is $5. You don't pay $5, you pay $5 plus whatever that sales tax is. How much is the seller keeping? $5. The extra amount of money the consumer pays is going to the government. So what's going to be true? The price the seller keeps will always be below the total price that consumers have to pay. So this new price, if we tax consumers, this will be the price that sellers keep, but how much do consumers pay? That amount plus the tax they have to give to the government. So we would go up to, what's the difference between our demand curve and our demand curve essentially minus the tax, right? Because our demand is a benefit, so a tax is like a negative benefit, so it's going to go down. So just like the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax was the value of the tax, the difference between our demand curve and the demand curve with the tax will be the value of the tax. So if I take the new price, I add to it the tax, this will be the new price that consumers or buyers have to pay. So notice what's true. The price that the buyer pays is greater than the price the seller keeps. That's exactly what we had in our previous model. From here on out, everything works the same. What did that tax do on consumers? What did it do to quantity? Reduced quantity. What is new consumer surplus going to be? The area below demand but above the price that consumers pay. What is producer surplus? The area below the price the sellers keep but above the supply curve. It has the exact same effects whether or not I tax producers or consumers. it's going to decrease producer and consumer surplus by the same amount. And in fact, it's also, and I kept the numbers the same here, if I tax consumers by the exact same amount, so it has to be the same value of a tax, like either a dollar tax on producers and a dollar tax on consumers. It can't be like $2 versus $1, but the same value tax, it doesn't matter if I put it on producers or consumers, I end up seeing the same reduction in quantity, right? So what's going to be true about tax revenue? It's going to be exactly the same as it was before, right? What's going to be true about my deadweight loss? It's going to be exactly the same as I had before. So it's a little bit harder, I think, to think about that when the consumer pays the tax, the new price we see in the market, that won't be the price the consumer pays. That's the price the seller keeps. Maybe a good way to think about taxes on consumers is the most obvious, which is a sales tax. You go into a store, something is $5. You don't have to pay $5 as a consumer. You pay $5 plus sales tax. How much does that person get to keep, though, that you're paying? Only that $5, right? So that's kind of how taxes on consumers work. I think it's a little bit less intuitive, but we end up with the exact same results. We see that consumer and producer surplus go down, we get deadweight loss created, and the quantity in the market goes down by the exact same amount, okay? So doesn't matter who we tax, we get the same results, right? Now, politically, why might we see more taxes on producers? Because what do you do that, I mean, I guess technically producers do, but, So if I'm thinking politically, right, why would I tax producers? Because most people voting are consumers. So it sounds better politically that I'm taxing these companies, these evil companies, but what are the same, does it matter? No. Doesn't matter if I tax producers or consumers, right? I get the same results in whatever market that tax is on, okay? Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Yeah. Yeah, so the value of this tax is $1, right? So once again, the way that if I had a shift in demand or supply here, it's just always going to be that price the consumer pays is higher and the price the seller keeps is going to be lower than the old equilibrium. That's just the way geometrically this has to work, right? Now, the reason why it's 50 cents higher, these are just values I came up with. In fact, we're going to talk about that difference between the old equilibrium and the new price for both groups won't always be the same, right? In this example, we'll start to then talk about something called tax incidence, which is who is bearing more of the burden of a tax. So in this case, how much more did consumers pay relative to before the tax? They were paying $4, they're now paying $4.50, so they're paying 50 cents more. How much less are suppliers getting to keep? 50 cents. So this would be an example where we say the tax incidence is equal. Both of them, the change in the price that they're getting to either, right, price is a good thing for producers, bad thing for consumers, but that difference between their new price and the old equilibrium is the exact same for both groups. That won't always be the case, and we'll look at some examples later on in today's class where that's not the case. Yep. So you're kind of thinking ahead, right? Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So just kind of working through this a little bit quicker. A, B, and E, we said would represent before this tax the consumer surplus. C, D, and F was producer surplus. After I have this tax, and let's just say I don't have the curve here just for the sake of not making it as muddied up, but here's the new higher price. Let's say we had an increase in a tax on producers. We could actually get this result if we tax producers or consumers, right? So the new price that consumers pay is higher. The new price the seller gets to keep is lower. What is consumer surplus? We said that's area A. Producer surplus, area D. So what was lost by consumers? Area B and D. What was lost by producers? Areas C and F. So what did area B and C represent here? Tax revenue. So tax revenue, area B is going to be tax revenue that came from consumer surplus. Area C is going to be tax revenue that came from producer surplus. So part of the tax is going to end up getting paid by both parties. It doesn't matter who I put the tax on, both groups are going to have a surplus loss, right? Part of their surplus they lose will be transfers to the government. So before with price ceilings and floors, we had transfers of surplus from consumers to producers or vice versa. Now we've got transfers of surplus from producers and consumers to the government. Now, what did we also have? Area E and F would be deadweight loss. Area E was deadweight loss that came from consumers. Area F was deadweight loss that came from producers. Yep. Okay. Any questions here before we keep moving? The next thing that we're going to talk about, I kind of alluded to it with your question, was the idea of tax incidence, right? So we'll kind of get this all up here. What tells us about who is actually bearing more of the burden of a tax? Okay. Well, a simple way, right? If I think about just more broadly in this like larger kind of scope, I'm looking at a graph. If I look at the loss to consumer surplus and the loss to producer surplus, whoever has a greater loss is going to be bearing more of the burden, right? So we could calculate the actual surplus values before and after a tax. And if consumer surplus goes down by more than producer surplus, we would say that consumers are bearing more of the burden of that tax. They're impacted negatively in a larger way. Now, what will also indicate if that's the case to us is simply by looking at the difference in the price that consumer is paying and the old equilibrium, and comparing that to the old equilibrium price relative to the price that the seller now keeps. Whichever of those differences is larger, that's the group that is bearing more of the burden of this tax. So I think putting some values to this maybe will make this a little bit easier than getting too lost in kind of these subscripts and then thinking through all this, right? So in this example, who was bearing more of the burden of the tax? I think I already said this, but they were bearing it equally. Why? Because the difference between the price the consumer paid after the tax and the old price was 50 cents. And the difference between the old price that the seller kept, the old equilibrium price was 4, the new price they keep is $3.50, they're keeping 50 cents less. So both of them were kind of negatively impacted the exact same amount by this tax. What if I had numbers that looked like this? All right. And we can kind of calculate deadweight loss. I've just got some additional numbers if you wanted to kind of work through this. We're just going to use this depiction just to get the idea of tax incidence, right? So sometimes I put things in the slides just like extra review if you want to go back to them, right? Just more examples of what we've already looked at. So here, what was the old equilibrium price? $1.50. After that tax, what's the new price that consumers pay? $2.25. So how much more are consumers paying for every unit? 75 cents. How much are sellers keeping after that tax? $1.25. Now, what's the value of this tax? Well, if consumers were now paying $2.25, sellers were keeping $1.25, what was the value of the tax? Just the difference between those, right? When the consumer pays $2.25, the seller gets to keep that minus the tax. So if they're only keeping $1.25, the tax must have been $1. So the same $1 tax we were looking at before that had equal tax incidence, now how much less are sellers keeping? They were getting $1.50, now they're only getting to keep $1.25, so they're keeping 25 cents less. So who has kind of a bigger gap there, or who is going to be very, so who has a larger gap between their new price and the old equilibrium? Consumers. 75 cent kind of higher is larger of a difference than 25 cents less that the sellers are keeping. So we would say that the consumers are bearing more of the burden here. Or if we actually made the calculations, the loss of consumer surplus would be larger. Yeah. So it would be based off of what the actual demand and supply equations are. Like I'm coming up with hypothetical values here. What you could actually do, oh, do I have a depiction here? I think I've got one in the quiz we'll actually look at. But if I had like a grid line, I'm coming up with these prices, just where are my supply and demand curves, right? And so what's going to tell me about who bears more of the burden is the next thing we're going to talk about, which is closely related to the slope of those curves, which is something we've already discussed, which is elasticity, right? So the idea of why in that last example were consumers hurt more, why was that gap between the price that they paid and the old equilibrium, why was that greater than it was for producers? We can kind of use some extremes to point this out, but I'll just kind of set up initially like what that relationship looks like, okay? So basically, we can kind of summarize this with, and I have it said this way in the slides. I'm going to put it a slightly different way. Whoever is more elastic, what does a tax do to the prices for both groups? It was changing the price, increasing price for consumers, lowering it essentially for suppliers, how much they got to keep. So whoever is more responsive, they would be more elastic. Do you think they can, so whoever's more responsive is going to be able to avoid more of the burden of that tax? So if you're more responsive, whether it's consumers or producers, whoever is more responsive or more elastic, they can avoid the burden of the tax. Whoever is more inelastic, they're not responding. They're walking around. They don't even realize there's a tax on this good. They keep doing the same thing. They're going to bear a lot more of that burden because they're not changing their actions according to this, they're not taking this new tax into consideration. I always use this example too. If you want to remember how this like relationship works, whoever is more elastic or more responsive, we said, can avoid the burden. That means the other person, whoever's more inelastic, is going to bear more of it. So if I'm walking around on campus and one of these dumb people on electric, I shouldn't say the people are dumb, but the electric scooters I can't stand, they come zooming through like campus, me and someone are standing there and they come barreling at us. Whoever is more elastic and throws the other person in front of the scooter, who's going to bear more of the burden? The person who was inelastic, right? So whoever is more elastic or more responsive, I can avoid the burden of things. Same thing would apply to taxes, right? If I'm more elastic, I can avoid the burden of that tax. Dumb way of remembering it. I shouldn't say it's dumb, but it's not a very technical way of remembering it, right? But that's the idea, okay? So if I was looking at some values, how could I actually make this decision with some actual demand and supply equations? Well, if I calculated the elasticity of demand and supply, both of them in this example are what? Greater than 1. So both consumers and producers are elastic. But whoever is more elastic can avoid the burden of the tax. So in this case, who would bear more of the burden? Whoever is more inelastic or has the lower value, right? A higher elasticity measure means I'm more elastic. So I'll change this one as well, just to kind of give you a different example of this. So let's say instead of 1.3, if I can get this to ever load, let's say I had 0.3 and 0.5. Well, maybe I've now froze this computer, so that's great. Sometime today. Okay. So let's say instead, so that you guys can see this. Oh. Let's say I had these values, right? So in this case, both consumers and producers, we would say, are inelastic, but who avoids the burden of the tax is whoever is more elastic. So who's more elastic here? The higher value or suppliers. So who is going to avoid the burden? Suppliers, which means who is going to bear more of the burden of the tax? Whoever's more inelastic, which would be the consumers in this second example. Okay? So we look at the actual elasticity measures. That's going to tell us who's going to bear more of the burden, or I forgot who asked the question, but that's where those numbers come from, right? That's why the difference in the old equilibrium price and the new price consumers pays would be larger, because it must have been, in this example, we said who is bearing more of the burden? Well, the consumers had a larger gap in between the prices. So who must have been more elastic here? Well, who's bearing more of the burden? We said that gap for consumers was 75 cents. For producers, is only 25. So who's bearing more of the burden of that $1 tax? Consumers, which must mean they are more inelastic. So the producers here must be more elastic. Okay. All right. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So I'm going to draw out two extremes here to kind of get at a principle that would work for not just the extremes. And I've got it in the slides, but I'm going to kind of build it out here and try to do a side-by-side comparison. So let's say I've got two markets, and I'm going to keep supply the same in both, right? These will be weird to think about, but understanding the extremes will help us think about the directional changes, okay? So let's say I had perfectly what demand? Horizontal means that a small change in price here, right, would change the demand. So they're very elastic, right? Horizontal demand was perfectly elastic. If I have a tax, and I could use a tax on consumers or producers, I think it's easier to think about usually on producers, so I'm going to draw it out that way. So let's say I have this tax on producers. This is a weird one, where what was consumer surplus before? The old equilibrium price was here. What was consumer surplus prior to this tax? 0. After the tax, I see that this quantity goes down. What is my new consumer surplus? It's actually still 0. So this is a weird one. So did consumers did they have any loss of surplus? No. They end up paying the same price as before. They were perfectly elastic. They avoided the entire burden, which means who bore the entire burden of this tax? It must have been producers. So what was producer surplus before? The area below price, but above our supply curve. That was like old producer surplus. What is producer surplus after this tax? Well, here's kind of the new price consumers pay, but what do sellers get to keep? That amount minus the tax, or where we would be at on the old supply curve. So in this example, what is producer surplus now? This smaller area. So all of the surplus lost was coming from who? Producers. Who has to be more elastic if demand is perfectly elastic? Consumers will definitely be the most. So who is more inelastic here? Suppliers, which led to they bore the entire burden of this tax. Now, obviously, like nothing is probably truly perfectly elastic, but understanding the extremes, whoever is more elastic, they can avoid a lot more of the burden. If they are perfectly elastic, suppliers will bear the entire burden if consumers are perfectly elastic. Okay? Now, we would still have what? Some deadweight loss here. Here's our kind of tax revenue. Okay? So you had perfect elasticity. Like whoever is more elastic, you can avoid a lot more of the burden. If you ever had perfectly inelastic demand, this is going to be a weird one. But if we had a perfectly inelastic demand curve, so here would be kind of our old equilibrium quantity and our old equilibrium price. Okay? Just where supply is equal to demand, right? So if I have perfectly inelastic demand, if I tax, so what was consumer surplus before? It's going to be a weird one. It's the area above price, but below my demand curve. So it would actually be this entire area. After the tax, what's the new quantity? Where does my new supply curve with the tax hit my demand curve? Right here, right? So if I had truly perfectly inelastic consumers or producers, it would work either way. But if I tax something where someone is perfectly inelastic, they don't respond at all to that. So what's going to happen to the change in the quantity? Stays exactly the same, right? So because of this tax, what is the new price that consumers pay? It would be up here, but notice the price the seller keeps would be that amount minus the tax. So how much less are producers getting? They're getting the same amount. Because the consumers, so suppliers here were more elastic because consumers were perfectly inelastic. But if consumers are perfectly inelastic, producers won't bear any of the burden. Consumers, being so inelastic, they're going to bear the entire burden. So what ends up happening, all this area in the middle here becomes, well, if it's the quantity after the tax times the value of the tax, this would be government revenue. And all of that loss of surplus comes from consumers. Okay? So kind of understanding the extremes also kind of helps solidify this idea that whoever is more elastic, they can avoid all the burden. If you're perfectly inelastic, or if you're more inelastic, you're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay? So that's kind of what the extremes would look like. I've got some other depictions in the slides, but I'll kind of let you kind of, copy this down. I think it's probably easier to see here. What else do I want to do? We've got what? About 15 minutes left. So I'll go through this kind of quickly. This is the exact same graph we were looking at before. So I'm not going to, if we wanted to calculate producer and consumer surplus when it was in equilibrium, we've already kind of discussed that. We're just looking at that equilibrium price. Area above that, below the demand curve, was 800. After this tax, what would the new price consumers pay be? So after the tax, our new price in this market will be where the new supply curve where the tax hits demand. That's going to be at a price of what? So the new price the consumer pays will be 60. What's the value of this tax? The value of the tax will always be the vertical difference between either your supply curve and your supply curve plus the tax, or if we had it on consumers, your demand curve and your demand curve plus the tax. So the value of the tax here should be what? 20, right? Now, if I also think about what would this green area represent? Tax revenue, what did we say the height of that rectangle would always be? The value of the tax, which sure enough, that difference between the supply curve and the supply curve with the tax was that $20. So this blue area should be my consumer surplus. This is the new price consumers pay. Area above that, below the demand curve. So it's what? 30 times a half, or 450. Right? If I then look at what's the new price that sellers keep, it'll be the price the consumer pays minus that $20 tax. So the new producer surplus would be this orangish area, or 30 times a half, or 450. So in this example, if I look at the change in consumer and producer surplus, in both cases it was what? $350 lower. So what must be true about the elasticities of supply and demand here? The exact same. They both have the same loss of surplus, so they're bearing the burden equally, which means they must have the exact same elasticity measures. Now, I could have also looked at the prices. How much higher of a price are consumers paying after the tax? We're going from an old price of 50 to 60, so $10. How much less are suppliers keeping? 50 to 40, so 10. That also indicates to us they're bearing this burden equally. And that'll always be the case. Okay? Well, sorry, it won't always be the case that's equal, but the difference in prices will always tell me the same thing as looking at that change in consumer and producer surplus. Okay? And then tax revenue, we said, just the value of the tax is going to be the height of that rectangle. Quantity sold after the tax is the kind of base. So 20 times 30 would give us that tax revenue of 600. And then deadweight loss, I can calculate the area of this red triangle, but what could I also do? What was total surplus prior to the tax? Just consumer plus producer surplus, so 1,600. What is total surplus after? Well, consumer surplus and producer surplus is 450, so 900, right? Who do I have to also factor in after the tax? So I have 900 from producers and consumers, but I also had 600 from the government. So I have 1,500. Total surplus went from 16 to 1,500, or that deadweight loss was $100. Okay. So when we kind of use the surplus values, we need to remember tax revenue is another party now. Government surplus we need to take into consideration. Okay. Any questions on that before you? Okay. So we've got what, 10 minutes here, a little bit. So I'll just reference this a little bit. You won't necessarily get like specific questions on the quiz about this, but it kind of leads us into thinking about some things about trade-offs. So let's say I had a small tax, okay? My tax revenue, it's okay, but what did I create? A very low deadweight loss here, right? Very small tax. I'm not going to change the market by much, so it won't generate a lot of tax revenue, but my deadweight loss will be relatively small. Now, if I have a larger tax, it's actually kind of hard to see. I mean, I don't know, relative to before, is that a larger rectangle by having this larger tax? It might be a little bit larger, but they look pretty similar, right? But the larger the tax, maybe I can generate a little more tax revenue, depending on what the elasticity of supply and demand look like. But what am I definitely doing to my deadweight loss? Increasing it. Now, eventually I'll get to a point that, yeah, when I increase my tax, that's going to be a good thing, right? In terms of generating tax revenue, because each unit I'm getting a larger amount from. But every time I increase the tax, what am I doing to quantity? Pushing it down, which a lower quantity, how much money am I generating from a tax? The tax times the new quantity, right? So eventually I get to a point, if I keep on increasing the tax, yeah, that's a good thing because it's a larger tax on each unit, but I've decreased the number of units by so much. What has actually happened? I'm actually generating less tax revenue than I was with a small tax, right? But larger and larger taxes will always have what effect on deadweight loss? It's always increasing it. When you think about the most extreme case, the largest tax is to put someone in jail for something, right? It's a really high cost. So what am I hoping with that? A large enough tax should push the quantity all the way down to 0, right? Or why do we tax things like alcohol and tobacco with additional taxes compared to other products? We're hoping to push that quantity down to 0. Now I say that might be what the government says. So large taxes on things like alcohol and tobacco, yes. From this, I'm going to create large deadweight loss. But what did we talk about? I could generate no deadweight loss if people are perfectly inelastic. What do you think is probably true about elasticity of things like alcohol and tobacco? A lot closer to being inelastic. So the government knows that I can have large taxes and not suffer as much deadweight loss, right? But the size of the tax, it would be a much more difficult thing to kind of determine the optimal tax. We would have to know something about the elasticity measures, but we know that the larger and larger the tax, holding everything else equal, we're going to get larger and larger deadweight losses, okay? So I've got kind of a little summary here of some of the things that we've talked about. I'm not going to waste time for just making sure we have enough time to get through everything else today. I also had this little example, which we kind of won't work through. I don't want to waste our time. I want to make sure we have enough time to get through this in-class quiz, but then also talk about something else before we leave today. It was just an interesting example where they tax plastic bag use, thinking that it'll reduce quantity, but they actually got this weird effect where people didn't feel as bad now using plastic bags because they were paying for it. So the tax actually had a simultaneous increase in demand and actually caused there to be a higher amount. So I might revisit this idea because it's kind of interesting and puts together some things that we've talked about on Tuesday's class. But for us today, I want to take a look at this in-class quiz. And so we've got, oh, I'll change the time to be 11:25. Well, maybe. There we go. So that should show up on the home page now under module 5 and 6. So we did not get to one thing today. So if you look at these slides, we didn't talk about subsidies, okay? I had an idea that we probably wouldn't have enough time this week. I'm okay with that because next week there's a little bit less material. So we are going to hold off on talking about subsidies until next week. So we will take a quick look at this in-class quiz, okay? And then I'll kind of mention something related to those subsidy questions that you might see on the practice problems. So we talked about taxes today. These should hopefully be relatively easy, right? if I wanted to look at producer surplus, right, before and after this tax, right, I've got the values here, but I want to kind of talk through how we would do this on a graph. Is anybody having Wi-Fi issues? The last class did too, which is why I'm giving you the answers. I'll probably open this up so that after class, this will be due at the end of the day today. There's like half the class having issues. So here, kind of pay attention to the answers. And if you're in class, this should be very easy to get by the end of the day, right? So if I'm looking at producer surplus, what is going to be the price that sellers keep after this tax? So the new price consumers pay will be where that new supply curve plus the tax hits my demand curve, but the sellers only get to keep that minus the tax. So the new price sellers get to keep is 45. So the area below that price but above their supply curve, this should be producer surplus. So the area of that triangle would be what? 35. The base of it goes from 0 to 35. 35 times 35 times a half would give me that 612.50. Okay. So we looked at a lot of examples like this. You know, some of these in-class quizzes, I want you to have the problems as we're thinking about getting up close to the next exam to be able to review, right? So I told you the value of the tax is 25 here. How could I find that on the graph? It's just the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve plus the tax. So the difference here would be 70 to 45, which is that $25 tax I told you about. Now this one shouldn't be bad at all. What is total tax revenue? So if I'm looking for the shape, it would be what? This rectangle in the middle, right? It's not a technical way of remembering it. Why is it that? Because the difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps, that value or the height of that triangle should always be the value of the tax. If I take the value of the tax and I multiply it by the new quantity after the tax, that should be total tax revenue. So what? 25 times 35 should give me that 875. Okay. And then if I'm thinking about my deadweight loss, what area is that going to be? It's going to be the area between the old equilibrium quantity and my new quantity after the tax, but between the supply and demand curve, right? All of that total surplus that was lost because after this tax, I'm no longer seeing these units being produced and consumed in the market. So that triangle, the height we said was always going to be the value of the tax, so 25. The base is always going to be how much quantity was reduced by, so 15. 25 times 15 times a half should give us that 187.50. Okay. So those are the only 3 questions you need to answer on this quiz. If you can't access it because of the Wi-Fi in here today, it'll be open after class to the end of the day. Give me 1 second. And then don't worry about question 4. Okay. I will go in after the fact, after today, tomorrow. I'll update the quiz so it's only scoring the first 3 questions. Did you still have a question? Okay. So this last one is about subsidies. So you're going to want to listen to the next thing for the next couple minutes, okay? So this question I'll end up taking off of this quiz, so it won't count against you. I have to update that tomorrow. The quiz for this week, there will be a question at the end. It will have subsidies in it. In the question, I will give you the answer. It will be bolded and it will say, this is the answer to this question. You should not get it wrong. It'll be the very last question of the quiz. I'm going to give you the answer. It's about subsidies. I still want you to have it there to be able to review before the next exam. We will talk about subsidies on Tuesday's class. Now, you're going to want to listen to this before you leave as well. The next kind of Canvas discussion, I will post as soon as we are done with class, okay? It is going to be related to minimum wages and employment. I will likely also at the beginning of Tuesday's class revisit this, right? But based off what we did on Tuesday's class, you can start to read through these articles. I summarize, you don't have to go through them with a fine-tooth comb. I summarize them kind of like the last one. I give you some potential questions to think about, try to lead you down different paths to think about the relationship between a price floor, minimum wage, and its impact on the quantity in the labor market. Now, what you need to do to make sure there's no confusion, the last time was when I wasn't able to be in class, to remind you, so I'll remind you of this next week, you will need to post your initial response to this. It needs to be well thought out. That will be worth 5 points. In your response, you need to support something, question you've answered or some statement you've made using this BLS data link. It has a bunch of different tables that have minimum wage broken down by demographics, region of the country, type of occupation. So you will tell me what table you accessed. They're all at the bottom here. And then you will use some of the numbers, and some of the questions I had at the end were like, what surprises you the most about some of these numbers? So mention the specific table, mention the specific statistics that support like why you found this result to be either counterintuitive to the models we looked at. You might not have expected this result based off of just thinking about what groups were impacted positively or negatively by the minimum wage. And once again, I'll kind of mention this again next class. It won't be due until the end of the week or at the end of the day, Friday next week. Okay, so you'll see that published. It may take a little bit longer for me to get the quiz published this afternoon because I want to change that question to give you the answer on that final one. And then that in-class quiz, because for whatever reason, Wi-Fi isn't working in here today, they'll be due at the end of the day today. Okay? All right, so that's everything. Have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys in class on Tuesday. You too.